Bet horse racing on DRFTV. We'll match your first deposit of $200. Get free expert picks and past performances, plus weekly cash back. All from Daily Racing Form, the most trusted name in horse racing.
Hi everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski are taking a look at the second jewel of the Triple Crown, the feature race at Pimlico on Saturday, race 13. It is the Grade 1 Preakness, going a mile and 3/16 for the 3-year-olds. Craig, a field of 9 were entered, but we got some news this morning, right before we're recording this video, that the morning line favorite, Muth, will be withdrawn, came up with a temperature after traveling, according to trainer Bob Baffert, so he will not be participating, and that really throws a monkey wrench into this Preakness because he was legitimately the horse to beat based on his performance in the Arkansas Derby, where he defeated eventual Kentucky Derby winner Mystic Dan, and now it feels like Mystic Dan is likely to inherit the favorite's role.
I would think so. I'm not sure how heavy of a favorite he's going to be. I think this maybe opens up the race a little bit, but no doubt he'll be the favorite. I think it's not quite as competitive a race without Muth, but I think it's still pretty good, and it's still an intriguing betting race.
Yeah, I know there was some talk last week about how this was coming up as a weak Preakness, and when entries were taken, it actually felt like it came up a pretty strong race. Unfortunately, Muth was a major component to that. With him coming out, it does make it an easier task for Mystic Dan to potentially win those 2 legs of the Triple Crown. We'll see how that works out for him. We should mention before we get into the handicapping, Craig, that there is rain predicted on Saturday at Pimlico. The forecast has sort of been going back and forth all week. As of this morning, it looks like there is going to be rain on Saturday, so the track could come up wet. It's probably not going to be a problem for Mystic Dan, maybe not a problem for some others in here. And to get a sense of the kind of trip that Mystic Dan might pull in this race, let's take a look at the TimeformUS pace projector. And with Muth coming out of this race, Craig, it does feel like his stablemate, the number 9, Imagination, is going to be in control of the pace.
It sure does. It looks that way on paper. He's been the fastest horse. He's been the horse that's pretty much a front runner almost every time he runs. I do wonder, with the 2 horses shown close to him, both being trained by Wayne Lucas, if maybe one of them won't be given instructions to go up there and not let Imagination have things his own way. But that would take whichever horse that would be kind of out of their preferred running style.
Yeah, and the scratch of Muth does really hurt some of the closers in this race, particularly the 3 drawn down towards the inside, including the horse with the LP flag on the pace projector, that being the number 3, Catching Freedom. He's a horse that wants a pace to close into. We'll see if he's going to get it after Muth comes out of this Preakness. Well, let's go through this field in post-position order, beginning with the number 1, Mugatu. I think most people regard this as the outsider in the field. He's likely to be the longest shot on the board. Craig went off at 181-1 when actually beating half the field in the Bluegrass last time, but was just kind of picking up pieces that day in a race that featured a very fast early pace. Unlikely to get that kind of pace scenario here, and big question mark as to whether this horse is even good enough to be competitive.
Yeah, I mean, that was his only dirt race showing in the PPs, and it was his best race if you wanted to hang your hat on something. But yeah, he wasn't really competitive in the Bluegrass. Not sure what he's doing here. He wouldn't be for me.
The number 2 is Uncle Heavy, also going to be a big price in this race, Craig, though I think some handicappers might get a little bit more interested in him if this track does indeed come up wet on Saturday, because Uncle Heavy is 2 for 2 over wet, sealed surfaces, earning his victory in the Grade 3 Withers over that kind of going back in early February. And if you want to make an excuse for his Wood Memorial last time, you could say, well, he had some interrupted trading. He was in a quarantine that affected horses leaving Aqueduct after that Withers, had limited trading leading up to the Wood Memorial. Then he drew the outside post in a 12-horse field. Didn't get the worst trip after that, but just felt like things weren't really going in Uncle Heavy's direction after that Withers. Now he's had some more consistent training leading up to this Preakness, so maybe he delivers a better effort, but he's another one that could be compromised by pace.
Compromised by pace, and also looking at that speed figure column, he's just never ran a speed figure that's remotely competitive with the better horses in here, even when he took the Withers. Now, I would expect him to run better than at 104. That happened back in early February. We're in the middle of May. Maybe he can hit the 110 mark, but that would still leave him wanting for as far as finding the winner's circle.
The number 3 is Catching Freedom. He was the Louisiana Derby winner in his final round prep for the Kentucky Derby. Went off at 8-1 in that race and ran respectably. Got one of the better rides in the field, probably the second best ride behind the one that Brian Hernandez delivered on winner Mystic Dan, as Flavien Prat just stayed on the inside, tried to follow the winner for as long as possible. Just lacked the same early speed as Mystic Dan, was a little bit shuffled back in the early stages of that race to wind up further back in the pack. That really wasn't a detriment to horses in the Kentucky Derby. You see those two red color-coded pace figures for the first couple of calls. That really helped horses coming from off the pace. It was a race that mostly fell apart behind Mystic Dan, and Catching Freedom was very much with that flow, even though he moved just slightly sooner than some of the other closers in the field. He's a horse that had been improving with every start leading up to that Kentucky Derby, Craig. You could argue he actually took another step forward, even finishing 4th in the Kentucky Derby. So he's been in good form, and it has to be taken as a good sign that Brad Cox is coming back in this race, because it really is not Brad Cox's MO to run a horse back in 2 weeks, especially at this highest level. So the horse must have bounced back out of the Derby in good form.
I would think so. I was surprised to see him in the entries when I returned from a brief vacation last weekend. But like you, I think that's a good sign. And I love his speed figure pattern for a 3-year-old. As you said, he's basically gotten better in that measurement every single race. The one time he just had that small 1-point regression was in the Risen Star, where that was just a crazy slow pace, and I don't put a whole lot of stock in those speed figures. So he certainly seems good. I guess the scratch of Muth would be a little bit of a question mark against him, seeing that he needs pace, but I know you think he can stay a little bit closer than what you might garner looking at his last couple running lines.
Yeah, he's gotten a little shuffled back in a few races, and I think he has more tactical speed than people give him credit for. We'll see if he's able to use it on Saturday. The number 5 is Mystic Dan, the Kentucky Derby winner, and I think the big problem with him, Craig, especially now after the scratch of Muth, is that if you didn't have him last time at 18-1, now you're going to have to swallow a much shorter price on Mystic Dan, probably somewhere in the 9-5, 2-1 range if he doesn't even go lower than that. He ran really well to win the Kentucky Derby. I think we agree on that. He got a very good trip from Brian Hernandez Jr., as I was saying, just saved ground every step of the way. But he was also one of the few horses that was in attendance to that very fast pace that was still around at the end. The 2nd through 5th place finishers in that Kentucky Derby all came from anywhere from 13th, I think, through 18th in the early stages to occupy those positions late in the race, whereas Mystic Dan moved much earlier than those runners, actually taking the lead at the top of the stretch before getting a little tired in the late stages, justifiably so. That was a big effort from him. He also has a big effort over a wet track in the Southwest going back to February. And if the track comes up wet on Saturday, I would imagine that would just throw more support in his direction.
For sure. I mean, I do think there's a couple things you have to be concerned of. One is the 2-week turnaround, which normally with a Ken McPeak trainee, that's not an issue because he really likes to run his horses, and great. I love that. But he did express a little hesitation with Mystic Dan as far as maybe running in this race or not. The horse did come back on 2 weeks rest earlier in his career and didn't run well at all. Now he did stretch out 2.5 furlongs that day. So maybe that had more to do with it than the 2 weeks. But when you're taking a really short price, I think that is a concern. But like you, I mean, I think he ran very well in the Kentucky Derby. Yes, he saved all the ground, and maybe he was 3rd best, but those other 2 horses aren't in here. And I'd even argue he ran right up there with them because of the pace factors that you mentioned. So I'm expecting a good run from Mystic Dan. I just don't think he's going to offer any value.
Up next are a pair of Dwayne Lucas trainees, including the number 6, Seize the Gray, caused a minor upset when he won the Grade 2 Pat Day Mile on the Kentucky Derby undercard just a couple of weeks ago, and ran well to win that race, Craig. There was a hot pace up front that he actually got an interesting trip where he was contesting the pace early, backed off around the far turn, and then came again between horses to ultimately earn that victory. I will say, though, that didn't seem like it came up the strongest edition of the Pat Day Mile that we've ever seen. The speed figures would sort of confirm that impression, and Seize the Gray is just a horse that's going to have to get a little bit faster overall, but one feather in his cap is that he is one of the few horses in this race that does own a victory over a sloppy track, did that breaking his maiden as a 2-year-old.
Yes, I mean he's fine. He ran fine in that Pat Day mile, but it's not a race I was impressed with. When I made the speed figures, I was certainly disappointed in the number that he got. That's usually a race that comes back quicker. There was plenty of pace in the race. Now he was part of it, but we give extra credit for that. So at the end of the day, it was just kind of a slow race. I do wonder if he's going to be the one that's sent up to maybe press Imagination early, because he does have that speed. We saw it last time. I mean, they were moving on the front end, and he seems more likely to me than Just Steele to be the one to take first crack at that leader.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point with him. You'll notice there's really nothing but red color-coded pace figures splashed all across his past performances. Probably not going to find himself in a race here that's going to get red color-coded pace figures, so maybe he's going to be able to be much more forwardly placed, as that pace projector would indicate. The number 7, Just Steele, the other D-Lane Lucas horse in the race, kind of a tough read, Craig, because on his best day, there is no doubt that he is one of the most talented horses in this field. We saw that too back in the Arkansas Derby, where he actually finished over 4 lengths ahead of the Kentucky Derby winner, Mystic Dan, only losing to Muth, who is now not running in this race. That 118 TimeformUS speed figure, among the fastest numbers anybody in this field has earned. However, his Kentucky Derby was pretty disappointing. I get it that he was involved in a fast pace that collapsed that day, but he was finished maybe 6 furlongs into that race, even dropping out before fellow speeds Track Phantom and Fierceness. So I just wanted to see him stick around for a little bit longer, but we have seen him bounce back from poor efforts in the past. That was the case from the Rebel into the Arkansas Derby, and he is another one that is running back in 2 weeks, and probably a good sign that he's doing so.
I think there are some things to like about this horse. One, I like the jockey change to Joel Rosario. I mean, Keith Asmussen rode him fine in the Arkansas Derby. I would say not so much in the Kentucky Derby. I'm not sure what he was doing up there battling on the pace, particularly after the start. I went back and watched the start of that race again. It was a very poor start. So maybe I'm willing to give him a little more pass and think that he can run back to that Arkansas Derby. If he does, he's going to run well. I mean, he would be a true contender in here, and he's definitely going to offer some value. I can see this horse easily going off at double-digit odds, even without Muth in the field.
The number 8 is Tuscan Gold, and he is a horse that is going to attract support because he really fits a pattern for trainer Chad Brown. Had a similar type of horse win the Preakness Stakes back in, I believe it was 2017, with Cloud Computing, a horse coming off a loss in a final round Derby prep, skipped the Kentucky Derby, won the Preakness. Same thing with early voting a few years ago. Almost got it done last year with Blazing Sevens in a very similar pattern, and Tuscan Gold certainly fits that profile of Chad Brown's type of Preakness winner, a lightly raced horse coming in, tried a final round Derby prep in the Louisiana Derby, just lost, but ran well, finishing 3rd to Catching Freedom after a wide trip, was 3 wide around the first turn, 4 wide around the second turn, ran very well in that race, and he's got this upward trajectory where you would assume that there could be more improvement left, Craig. Definitely a horse that is not going to have any problems with the mile and 3/16 distance based on what we've seen from him.
Yeah, I mean, he's already ran it and ran it well in the Louisiana Derby. He's a horse that he fits all the things you mentioned for Chad Brown, who's done excellent in this race. He's moving forward. I think he's a contender. I'm not sure what kind of price he's going to be, and if he hasn't quite shown the ability of a horse like early voting. Blazing Saddles, he didn't have the kind of speed figures, but that was a very weak edition of the Preakness last year that we saw. I think this one's a little tougher. I'm leaning towards being a little bit against this guy, but I won't be shocked if he wins. There's just too much history on the trainer side.
Yeah, Chad Brown was toying with the idea of running him in the Peter Pan, scratched out of that race to target the Preakness instead. We'll see if Tuscan Gold is able to continue that pattern for the Brown runners. And then closing out the field is the number 9, Imagination. He will be the sole Bob Baffert representative in this year's Preakness after the scratch of Muth. And we'll take a look at his most recent effort in the Grade 1 Santa Anita Derby, where he just lost to Stronghold, who went on to run a respectable race in the Kentucky Derby. I think he lost the Derby by a dozen lengths, but was in the mix at the top of the stretch before making that early move into the pace took its toll on him. So Stronghold flatter the form of this race somewhat. Another horse coming out of this race, Tapalo, came back to earn a big speed figure last week, but that was turning back in distance in the Las Barreras Stakes, so not sure really what to make of that. Imagination, Craig, he just shows up every time. He's typically involved in the finish. I do question some of the quality of the races that he's exiting, particularly two back in the San Felipe, where he was just beating one of his stablemates, Wind Me Up, as those two Bob Baffert trainees just basically dictated terms to the rest of the field and caused some problems for the only two competitors that showed up against them in that race. I don't know if I totally buy the speed figure for that event. And Imagination, just a tough horse to assess from a quality standpoint heading into this Preakness. But one thing that you can't argue with is the scratch of his stablemate is likely to leave him as the lone early leader.
Yeah, when we originally did our selections before Muth was scratched, I didn't have this guy in the top 4. And I'll be honest, I gave him a really long look here and considered putting him on top because I think he's going to be alone on the front end. I think you could even give him a little excuse last time. You mentioned that sprinter that he was dueling with. I think he probably cost him the Santa Anita Derby. He's a game horse, but at the end of the day, I just am not quite sure he's good enough. Like you, I don't think that California division is all that strong. Stronghold, he ran okay, but nothing for me to get too excited about. So I wound up leaving him off my tickets, but it doesn't mean I don't think he's dangerous. If somehow this horse wound up 10-1, I'd probably put him on my tickets for sure.
Yeah, as we transition to our picks, Craig, we both are going to stick to our guns and leave Imagination out of our top 4 for better or worse. I think for both of us, though, he's the horse that is most likely now to get bet down from his morning line because everyone is going to see that he is the lone speed in the race. He's the only Bob Baffert runner. All of that support that just assumed Baffert was going to win the Preakness is now going to flow into Imagination's camp. And I just feel like he's not going to offer value, even though I acknowledge, like you do, that he could be a danger on the front end. So we're going in slightly different directions in this Preakness. We've got the same 4 horses, just I think in almost exactly reverse order as you put the biggest price, the number 7, Just Steel, on top. And I get it. On his best day, he's dangerous.
Yeah, I know he was a horse you liked along the Derby Trail and some of those races, and I really didn't. But I came around in the Arkansas Derby. He ran very well, and I'm just willing to give him a pass for that last race. The start was terrible. He had no business on the lead. And I can just see a scenario here where he's sitting a perfect pocket trip in behind Imagination and his stablemate. And I just think he's going to run a much better race than we saw at the Derby. The value's there. He's certainly not the most likely winner, but I'm going with him. I think he's got a big shot.
And I had Catching Freedom on top with Muth in the race. Definitely that seemed like it was a better scenario for him. I'm going to keep him on top even with Muth coming out. I've got this idea that he is not as pace compromised as some people are going to believe he is. And I still think he is as likely to win this race, if not slightly more likely to win than Mystic Dan, given his overall body of work coming in. And he's probably going to be a much better price than that horse. So I'm going to stick with the number 3, Catching Freedom on top. The number 7, Just Steel for Craig in the Grade 1 Preakness Stakes on Saturday at Pimlico. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.